Hi, my name is Brett Underwood, and I will be talking about self monitoring and how it teaches kids to be responsible. I personally chose this topic because the school that I currently work at, we use a lot of self monitoring with a bunch of different kids, and it seems to be a very successful strategy. So I wanted to learn more about it. So, what is self monitoring? The definition is when a student independently tracks a target behavior by recording frequency or completing a self assessment. And there are two types. So, there's self monitoring attention, which is SMA, which is when the student determines if they're focusing their attention on the task at hand or if they're not. So, the big one for that is off task versus on task. And then self monitoring performance. The student self assesses an aspect of their work. So, productivity, accuracy, and strategy used. So a big one for that would be math. If they're not smart with their math, or in English, for example, how many times they skip over a word when they read out loud, they would circle it. So who can benefit from self-monitoring? Everyone. Research has shown that self-monitoring is really beneficial for all students, regardless of age and disability. Typically, though, self-monitoring is used to support students with different learning disabilities. But again, if you are a general education teacher in high school and you're like, wow, the student just not focusing on task, teach them how to self-monitor, like specifically in your class, and it will help you gain the student's attention more thoroughly. So, what are the steps of self-monitoring? So, step one, you identify and define the target behavior. Step two, design a data collection procedure and collect baseline data. Step three, design an intervention plan and prepare all the required materials. Step four, introduce self-monitoring to the student and teach them how to self-monitor. Step five, implement the intervention plan. And step six, fade, maintain, or generalize the intervention. And the intervention spoken about this entire presentation is all about self-monitoring. So step one, you identify and define the target behavior. So this means determine what the behavior is, whether it's them off task, speaking out, not raising their hand, variety of things. And then you define the behavior that is clear and measurable, also known as an operational definition. So an example would be Max demonstrates not being on task by looking away from his work, reading, recreation, so meaning he's reading whatever he wants. And then you can also add to that is it doesn't have a pencil in hand. It can just be whatever your specific student is not doing. Step two is then you design a data collection procedure and collect baseline data. So here, if the student doesn't have a consistent number of opportunities to demonstrate the target's behavior, data should be measured as a percentage. So if you give Susie 8 problems one day to do accuracy and then 10 the other, you would do a percentage because it's different and they don't have the same opportunities every time. If behavior does not take place over a significant amount of time, make sure the cue interval is short to ensure that the behavior is never missed. So if you have a student that almost instantly his off task lasts no longer than 30 seconds, maybe your cue interval should be 3 minutes. Or if he's off task for a significant amount of time, like 5, 2 minutes would be 2 or 3 would also be well. Just if it's short amount of time, you want to make sure intervals are very short so you don't miss the behavior. And once you determine how to gather data, you need to collect a baseline. And that's important for 2 reasons. One, you make sure the behavior is appropriate, and 2, you have a comparison for after the intervention. So you can see if it's working or not. And the reason, if you want to make sure the appropriate behavior is appropriate, say your student's demonstrating this once every 5 days, it's not really worth doing self-monitoring, more of just a correction. Step 3 is when you design the plan and prepare all the required materials. So here you would gather materials based upon the intervention. So you would do, if they are off task, you may need a worksheet every day. So you would print off a number of worksheets, make sure they have a pencil, and then a timer. And that can be a timer on their iPad, on their cell phone, or just a timer in class, whatever is easiest and most cost effective for you. But you should also keep the student's age and gender in mind. So for example, if you want a second grader to self-monitor, probably shouldn't rely on a cell phone because they might not have one. So at that case, you need to kind of improvise on whatever student works best for you and your student. And then you design a plan. So how to teach a student, and you collect the data, how you're going to measure it, how many weeks are you going to give it to see if the intervention's working, everything like that. And then you need to create a tracking sheet so the student is able to independently record the data. So on my tracking sheet, it's for off-task behavior. It's every 3 minutes, and it's, was he on task? Was she on task? Yes or no? And at the bottom is a plant because the student likes to color plants. And that's an easy way to flip through and be like, oh, so-and-so is on task 10 out of 10, 5 times. And you can kind of track that way easily without sitting there having to count the number. And it also just adds another built-in rewards if the student really enjoys coloring. And then step 4, you introduce the self-monitoring to this student and you teach them. Students must be taught. That cannot be stressed enough. You can't just plant this in front of the student and be like, all right, go to town, dude, because they will never understand it and they'll never properly do it. And so it will not be effective or beneficial to anyone. So how you teach them is you show them behavior, what it is, so they can independently identify the behavior. So you teach them, like, when you look away, this is what we're looking for. And then you model it and how to track it. So you demonstrate the behavior based on what they do, and then you track it yourself. And then after a few times of that, you let the student tell when you're doing the off-task behavior, and then they monitor it. And then they independently monitor and track their own behavior with heavy, heavy supervision and prompting. And once they master that, they go on to step 4, which is completely independent, where you implement the intervention plan. So you should still oversee your student to make sure it's running smoothly, but not so much that you're doing it for them. And if it's struggling, maybe you should add another support, like remodeling, redemonstrating. And then you start to ask the question, is this working for my student and me? And in step 6, you fade, maintain, or generalize the intervention. The whole goal of self-monitoring is so a student is able to regulate their behaviors without any external supports. So they don't need this tracking monitoring. They don't need a reward system. And that's achieved by gradually fading the intervention, meaning you take away the self-monitoring. And that can be increasing the cue interval time, a variety of things. And while the intervention is being faded out, you continue to monitor and take action if there's any regression. So if you notice Susie is off task more, you implement the intervention again until they are strong in regulating their behavior. And it's simply how to generalize it is you create opportunities in other settings to practice the behavior. So say you've been practicing in English, you take it to science and see if they can implement their off-task behavior there. And if they can, you can tell that the intervention is truly working. And this research strongly supports this. 6 of the 6 studies supported it as being an effective strategy in changing a problem behavior. So from Anderson and Weldahl in 2004, they said significant increased productivity and accuracy for most students. And then Joseph and Everly in 2011 said it's not only effective, but low cost and easy to implement, which as teachers, we don't have big budgets. So anything that's easy and low cost works the best for us. So is it practical? Yes. It's validated by many research studies, adaptable for almost any student. It's not time consuming, and it's very cost effective. You might need a pen, a paper, or a notebook or a timer. And both teachers and students find this intervention very positive. So overall, I would say that self-monitoring is a great cost-effective way to curb any problem behavior in a class. Thank you.